Good evening. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight, as we return from our extended hiatus, we're going to have a little impromptu catch-up on all the stuff that we've missed in the wonderful world of Tolkienalia over the last 6 or 7 weeks. I apologize, as I've apologized before, and I'm sure we'll apologize again for this unwieldy hiatus. It has at least come to something of an end. I am, from this point forward, predicting regular shows, though I know I've made that promise before. We'll see how it all shakes out, but I'm anticipating a regular Tuesday night slot, he said, on a Wednesday evening here on the Next Word Patreon for our schedule of live streams. More on that later in this evening's show. Good evening to Chris, to Hugh, to Dot, who is joining me live this evening. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. In fact, let's clarify out some of the schedule first. As many of you, I'm sure, know, I have begun a new day job. It is incredibly time consuming. It has robbed me of my vitality and will. I am like butter spread over too much bread and have been for these many weeks. But this project is now fully underway and is at least taking, if not less time, a more predictable kind of time out of my schedule. So our next episode of Shire Reckoning after tonight will be in 2 weeks. That will be Tuesday, March the 24th, where we will be picking up our discussion of the Jackson Hobbit trilogy with an extended and I'm sure enthusiastic discussion of The Desolation of Smaug. In fact, a surprisingly enthusiastic discussion because having revisited this film now twice in the last 8 weeks, I have watched this film, I have unlocked certain perspectives, I think, that reveal to me a film that is wrestling with its own inheritance, a film that is trying to reorient the story away from the Del Toro initial conception of what this trilogy was going to be, or what this duology was going to be, I suppose I should say, back to something more Jacksonian. And I think that we can see the proof of that in the text. So we will talk about that, as I say, in 2 weeks. 2 weeks after that, we will talk about the Battle of the Five Armies. And then 2 weeks after that, well, I don't want to call my shot too early, but I have been thinking a lot about Aragorn over the course of the last few weeks for reasons which will become obvious in just a few moments as we move on to our first topic for tonight. But I've been thinking about the character of Aragorn and how he is so fascinatingly elusive or informed, might be a better word, in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. We get so much of him, and yet his most pivotal moments don't exactly happen off screen, but they happen from a great distance. The narrative positions him, as it should, as king, rather than as one of the Fellowship, one of our companions, a protagonist in his own right. He is drawn out and elevated in those moments, and I'm thinking a lot about those moments and the ways in which Tolkien interrogates exactly that kind of heroism. So my predisposition at this moment, and we'll have some opportunity to discuss this over on the Patreon page. I will put up a poll to see if this is in accordance and alignment with everyone's desires, but I am pretty sure that after covering the Hobbit trilogy, we're going to dip into Beren and Luthien. We're going to dip into the collected volume that was released by Christopher Tolkien very close to the end of his career, one of the 3 final volumes that was released to kind of wrap up all of the work on the Legendarium and the enormous act of academic preservation, of conservation that Christopher Tolkien engaged in through half a century of scholarship and academia. I think we're going to look at the Beren and Luthien volume and tease out exactly how it is that Tolkien reveals and maintains distance with these characters. I think that's such a fascinating concept to dig into. I hope you feel the same way. That all is in the future, though. Before we get to that, well, we have to deal with the present. Well, we have to deal with the future, but a further off future that is somehow more urgent and impressive than our upcoming discussions, because we're going to have to catch up with some of the rumors and speculation about The Hunt for Gollum, which now seems to be slated for a pretty solid December 17th, 2027 release window, with principal photography beginning in June or July of this year, the middle of the New Zealand winter, for those of you keeping track at home. I'll say before we get into anything else, that if principal photography is supposed to begin even in June or even in late May, as I have seen some accounts suggest, that is a very short production window for a film of this scale, a film of this budget, a film with this kind of ambition and this kind of technical overhead. Basically, 18 months is a fast turnaround. So I'll be interested to see exactly what Circus et al. Do with this film. The biggest rumor that we have missed in the course of the last few weeks is, well, barely a rumor, honestly. Let me wrestle here with my slideshow and see if I can't share this slide with you. This was the allegedly official synopsis of the film released through theonering.net, a usually fairly responsible and fairly reliable source of Tolkien news. Let me show you this slide. I'll just read this aloud because it gives us a condensed synopsis of exactly the film that we were going to expect. Before the Fellowship, one creature's obsession holds the key to Middle-earth's survival or its demise. In The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, we meet young Smeagol, an outsider drawn to trinkets and mischief long before the One Ring consumed him and began his tragic descent into the tortured, deceitful creature Gollum. With the ring lost and carried away by Bilbo Baggins, Gollum finds himself compelled to leave his cave in search of it. Gandalf the Grey calls upon Aragorn, still known as the Ranger Strider, to track the elusive creature whose knowledge of the whereabouts of the ring could tip the balance toward the Dark Lord Sauron. Set in the shadow time between Bilbo's birthday disappearance and the Fellowship's formation, this perilous journey through Middle-earth's darkest corners reveals untold truths, tests the resolve of its future king, and explores the fractured soul and backstory of Gollum, one of Tolkien's most enigmatic characters. The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, in cinemas winter 2027. Now, obviously, there are some things that we can just oppose. I think that there are some things that we can just, bracket with citation needed right here on this slide. I should note that Warner has said in the aftermath of this release that this is not an official synopsis and an official synopsis has not been released, but come on, this is the film we're talking about, right? Well, to a certain extent. The focus here on Gollum, I think, is interesting and were I a betting man, I would say ultimately somewhat misleading. There's little juice left in how Smeagol turns into Gollum. We get a really artful montage sequence during the original Jackson trilogy that basically gives us every beat of characterization that we need. Could we see it again? Yes. Will that be interesting and arresting to an audience that is already familiar with The Lord of the Rings? I think probably not, or at least insufficiently. So all of the juice here, let's be honest, is in young Aragorn. All of the narrative juice is in this adventure story that we've been promised for so long, that we have all, I think, speculated about to a greater or lesser extent. And you'll note that pivot right here in this outlined synopsis, right? In The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, we meet young Smeagol, an outsider drawn to trinkets and mischief long before the One Ring consumes him. Oh, well, cool, all right. And then we immediately break, right? We get a sentence of that, followed by, with the ring lost and carried away by Bilbo Baggins, Gollum finds himself compelled to leave his cave in search of it, which I think is probably replicative of the structure of the film that we are ultimately going to get. I don't anticipate that we are going to spend a lot of time with Gollum's grandmother, for example. I just don't know how much they have there. Hugh is asking, I wonder which actor they will have playing Aragorn in this interpretation. I actually have some notes on this. Let me call this up here. I've got, in terms of the casting, Andy Serkis is back, of course, as well as directing the film. Sir Ian McKellen will return as Gandalf. McKellen has apparently also leaked that Elijah Wood will appear as Frodo, but again, I am skeptical. I understand the desire here. Let's be clear. The commercial economic desire to link this film to the original trilogy, to give it that stamp of authenticity, to give it that brand of canonicity. But I'm not sure how we are going to integrate these stories beyond a very trivial and conventional kind of framing device, the kind of framing device that we see in the Hobbit trilogy, right? Are we going to begin with Frodo and Gandalf on the deck of the ship to Valinor, pulling out of the Grey Havens, right? We turn away from Sam and Merry and Pippin standing there on the dock, and Frodo says, "There's just one thing I don't understand, Gandalf. Whatever happened to Gollum?" And Sir Ian, puffs on his pipe and twinkles his eyes, and then we crossfade into The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, with some Howard Shore music coming up behind. I would not be at all surprised if that is the extent of the Sir Ian and certainly the extent of the Elijah Wood that we are going to see in this story. Viggo Mortensen has said that he was open to the idea of returning in a way that made it absolutely clear that he was not, in fact, open to the idea of returning. He was apparently willing only to play Aragorn if Aragorn had aged as much as Viggo himself has, which just opened up a whole new faucet of speculation. Specifically, let's take a look at the rumored actors who are going to fill the main slots, presumably, in this story, or at least in the romance aspect of this story. You can see here on the left, Leo Woodle, and on the right, Anya Taylor-Joy. These are the actors apparently considered for our new Aragorn and Arwen. Leo Woodle, of course, interestingly, I know Leo Woodle best from Bridget Jones' Mad About the Boy, excuse me, which is a really great film and a completely undeserved redemption for what had become a very grim arc for the Bridget Jones movies. The first and last are great. You can miss the second and third by all means. Leo Woodle, though, generally more well recognized for his turn on The White Lotus, and I believe for the show Vladimir, which I have heard great things about, and I am actually going to pick up now on the strength of this bit of casting here. Anya Taylor-Joy, of course, I think really came to our attention in The Queen's Gambit, in which she is fantastic, and then a number of other things in which she is not to my taste. I think that was not a pun about the film The Menu, though it could have been. She does not generally work very well for me, though. Obviously, she has that ethereal aspect that we could buy as Arwen for sure. It was rumored, in fact, this morning, and then all but confirmed this afternoon, as of this recording, that we have another cast member, which is Kate Winslet, apparently being considered for the role of Gilraine the Fair, Aragorn's mom. You may remember Aragorn's mom performing a very brief and statuesque cameo in the Lord of the Rings trilogy as Aragorn visits her grave. A really tragic, compelling, fascinating figure, which again suggests, if indeed that is the part that Winslet is playing, that we are really orienting the story around Aragorn and not, in fact, about Gollum, which I think is both the right and prudent choice. I think that is both the most interesting creative choice and the most potentially successful economic choice that the film can make. Winslet is no stranger to working with Jackson, or wanting to work with Jackson at the very least. She was his first choice for Éowyn all the way back in the day, but she's an interesting actor. Of course, like an incredibly accomplished actor. It will be fascinating to see what happens with them. Oh, Hugh was suggesting that they would reverse them to appeal to a more modern audience, that we would gender flip our Aragorn and Arwen. I don't think, that's interesting, Hugh. You're kind of anticipating a conversation I was going to introduce a little later in the show. But I think that we're probably not going to mess with it to that extent. Though, there's some interesting stuff happening there. I don't know exactly how gendered either of those roles. I mean, they... That's an absolutely insane thing that I just said. Obviously, they are primarily, fundamentally gendered. There's really no way in which they are not gendered. They are archetypally masculine and feminine, as embodied in the stereotypes of men in the world of Tolkien and elves in the world of Tolkien too. But you could get some interesting things from those qualities which are not, in fact, as gendered in Tolkien's work as we often think that they are, as superficial readings often lead us to believe that they are. Again, we can go deep into the Beren and Luthien story as we will in the weeks to come, but also we can go deep into, Éowyn and Faramir. I think there is some really interesting stuff about the presupposition that we bring with us to gendered roles within the world of Tolkien, and also the way in which virtue is more independent and less directly associated with gender than we might otherwise think. It's an interesting conversation for sure. And as I say, we'll circle back to this in just a moment. All of this, of course, all of this speculation, all of these very charming headshots here, well, the upshot, the product of them really remains to be seen. We're not going to know until, well, I was going to say we're not going to know until December of next year, but that seems unlikely. All of the Hobbit films had trailers that came out at least a year in advance of their cinematic release. So it is possible that at Christmas this year, whatever is anchoring what remains of the movie theater industry here in these United States, by the time that we get to Christmas of 2026, will probably carry with it at least a teaser trailer for The Hunt for Gollum. We should not underestimate the enormous cultural power that these films in particular, right? Tolkien, obviously, The Lord of the Rings is an abstracted work, obviously, but these Jackson films in particular still have. The Fathom events that they ran in early January of this year were hugely successful. They demonstrate that there is still an appetite for this world and for these kinds of stories. It's interesting, and we're not really going to know, I think, until we get much closer what the film is going to be, like the underlying structure. What is this thing? Because I can't really imagine that Sir Ian McKellen is going to be gallivanting all around the countryside of Middle-earth in the course of this film. Sir Ian has already said that his Gandalf in this film will be in a more supportive advisory role, that he's going to be coaching from the sidelines more than he is going to be out there, you know, swinging his staff and writing Shadowfax across the plains, because Sir Ian McKellen is 86 years old. And he'll be 88 by the time that this film is eventually released. And if, as I have speculated before, as I believe deep in the roots of my soul, that this is something of a test, something of a trial balloon to gauge audience interest in a full reboot of the original trilogy, we're not going to commit to Sir Ian. It doesn't make sense to commit to Sir Ian as a relic of the old cast while recasting everyone else around him. He's not going to, at that point, at 88 years of age, assuming that this film is a huge success, sign up to a bare minimum 3-year production cycle for another movie, let alone another trilogy. And that would leave us in a weird place if we are recasting entirely. I could see Leo Woodall and Anya Taylor-Joy coming back to do the entirety of The Lord of the Rings, I guess. But if we really are committing to Sir Ian all the way through, and we're not going to simply limit him to a framing story and recast him for the main action of the story, then I believe that we are probably going to see a complete recast by the time that we get to the eventual, inevitable reboot of the story. Chris says in the chat, I love Sir Ian, but I would like Gandalf to be recast and be more actively involved in the action. I think that that's a really good call, Chris. I think that there are so many completely definitive performances in that original trilogy that it hurts to think that we would lose them, right? Can we imagine just casually, easily, a better Gandalf than Sir Ian? I'm not sure that I can, but if we're going to do something different with this trilogy, as we ought, as is the great benefit of adaptation, then we should, I think, lean as hard as we can into that direction and really try and find someone new, which is a difficult thing to think about, and certainly a difficult thing to argue in favor of, for sure. But as I say, particularly because I've been thinking so much about Aragorn and thinking about his inevitable depiction in this film, thinking about how we would revisit him. The other line, let me see if I can, let me come back here so that I can see if I can casually go back to the synopsis here that I have in my slides, because I wanted to call out that reference to the to Aragorn struggling with his, you know, the burden of kingship and his identity and so on and so forth, right? Which is, of course, not a part of Aragorn's character as we recognize it from the book, but is absolutely a product, almost entirely, almost like 99.9% a product of the Jacksonian imagination and the kind of convention of modern cinematic storytelling. Let me find this example here as I'll share that slide back with you here. Yes, the perilous journey through Middle-earth's darkest corners reveals untold truths, tests the resolve of its future king, and explores the fractured, stolen backstory of Gollum, one of Tolkien's most enigmatic characters. And when I mentioned earlier, citation needed, I was, of course, referring to the idea that Gollum is an enigmatic character. I don't think that Gollum is an enigmatic character in The Lord of the Rings. I don't think that Gollum certainly is an enigmatic character after being so well developed by Circus in the Jackson trilogy. I'm not sure there's a lot of meat left on that bone, but we will see when we get there. But I am interested in how Jackson threads this needle or how, in the first place, I guess, Circus in his Jacksonian mold here threads the needle of a movie Aragorn that is wrestling with the idea of kingship, but has not yet become king, is not yet the Aragorn that he will be, the Elisar that he will be ultimately, which is so much more interesting if we are tying in his mother, if we are drawing her into that particular story too. There is stuff there. There is good material there that I hope is handled in a way that is provocative, yes, but is also considered, that is more than just the melodrama version of the story. Not that I am in any position to argue against melodrama. Let's move on, because I also wanted to talk about a video game that I've mentioned before, in speaking of adaptation, a free adaptation. I've mentioned this video game before, but I have only just in the last couple of days sat down to finally play it. I'm referring to, if I can advance here through my slides, Tales of the Shire, a Lord of the Rings game, the very first game developed by the fine folks at Weta in New Zealand, the special effects house that has underpinned all of the Jacksonian efforts in Middle-earth. This game is what the kids are calling a lifestyle sim. It is similar in spirit and in execution to games like Stardew Valley or to Animal Crossing, or I suppose by extension to games like The Sims. You play in this game a hobbit of your own creation who moves from Bree to Bywater and, as is traditional in this kind of game, inherits a dilapidated house and a series of daily tasks that you then complete in order to improve your environment and build relationships with all of the other hobbits who live in the area, including canonical figures like Tom Cotton, Lily Cotton, Rosie Cotton, of course, Sandyman the Miller, Ted's dad, and so on. The game is set between The Hobbit and the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, though much closer to the latter than the former. Incidental dialogue in the game tells me that there is a Sam wandering around out there, and Rosie is clearly, not quite an adult by Hobbit measure, but approaching adulthood even by Hobbit measure. So we're not far from the beginning of The Lord of the Rings here. And it's a cozy little game of exploration and of crafting, and you go collect hazelnuts from the forest, and you water the rhubarb plants in your garden, and you make a new table for your kitchen, and you cook meals for your visiting friends, and most importantly, little graphs tick ever upward. That's the reward that you get. For everything that you do, you unlock the opportunity to do something new. Sometimes you have to do many things in order to unlock the opportunity to do something new, but that's the reward of the game. It is a game that you can sit and play for a little while every day and kind of take care of your tasks and then go back into your real life wishing that a little graph ticked up every time you went to get groceries or put gas in the car. What makes it interesting, though, from a Tolkien point of view, is how it handles the source material, because unlike most Middle-earth media, it is really seeking to evoke the sense of peace and comfort of the Shire. No black riders, no ruffians, no adventures. And the way that the game chooses to explore that space, partly, of course, as the product of compromises, right? The necessities imposed by gameplay, the presence of an active player forces change in how we approach and structure the world and the narrative. But these compromises and the product of these compromises is odd. There's some strange stuff going on just under the surface of this game. And I say this not in the spirit of, as I hit my microphone rather violently. I say this not in the spirit of nitpickery, right? This is not a CinemaSins assault on Tales of the Shire. This is not a discussion of which details are canon and where the game makes quote-unquote mistakes, right? The hobbits are diverse and interesting and generally adorable, which made the game, of course, a target for bigots who are inclined to make bad faith and small-minded arguments about representation out there on the internet. That is not what is important. That is not in any way in meaningful conflict with Tolkien's canon, with Tolkien's sense of the world. Yes, there are, in this game, tomatoes and maize, right? Curiously, the word maize, which does seem very out of place to me, but if we're going to be okay with potatoes, and we're going to be okay with pipeweed, then I guess we have to be okay with other products of the Americas, aka Numenor. No, I'm joking. Not really. The game, I'll advance this slide and show you exactly what the game looks like in practice. Here we see gardening. What I'm really interested in terms of this game is that it depicts a society which, partly because it is itself a game, is very bound by rules and standards and expectations. And yet, the game does away entirely with the class hierarchy, which is so definitive of our understanding of life in the Shire. For example, the hobbits in this game are well disposed toward the absent Bilbo Baggins. I say absent, I've only played about an hour of this game. He might show up later in the game, I have no idea. But for now, he is absent, but referred to in absentia with a great deal of respect, but not crucially because he is their social superior, not because he inhabits the very specific landowning role that he occupies in the books. Instead, for example, to take one example, right, Fosco Burrows, who provides you with the furniture for your neat and tidy little hobbit hole, simply admires Bilbo because of his taste in waistcoats, which is weird because it doesn't just misrepresent or misunderstand the social mechanisms of the Shire as we understand them from the books, but it fully inverts them by giving power to the individual. It removes the sense of not a social order, these people are aware that they exist in an intricate web of mutual responsibility, right? They are aware that they are a community. The entire game is predicated on the fact that they are a community, and your job is to help them, to draw them closer together, to unify them with a purpose, and to provide your labor too in the pursuit of those very much shared goals, right? It understands that there is a social order, but it dispenses entirely with the idea of social hierarchy. And it introduces these questions instead of taste and choice. Fosco Burrows likes Bilbo Baggins, but Fosco Burrows would not be at fault if he did not like Bilbo Baggins. If he found his taste in waistcoats odious, if he found them gauche, then he would not be exhibiting a moral failure in the way that characters like Sandyman the Miller, or, Ted, even more fully, even more completely, right, do demonstrate a moral failing by their incompatibility with their own social order, their lack of respect for how their society is ordered. I will say again, as I always say when we get into these discussions, I do not think this is a good way of running the world, right? I'm not speaking as an advocate for the feudal social order of Bywater and the Shire in general, but that is the terroir from which this story springs. That is a fundamental, an inescapable, an irreducible part of Tolkien's conception of the world. This step toward modernization, right, Hugh, this is what brings us back to this question of modernization and diversity and inclusivity, right? This step toward modernization and accessibility for a modern audience does kind of destroy the social stability, or if not the social stability, the social comprehensibility of the Shire. The Shire does not really make any sense as a, utopian socialist commune. Similarly, right, we can see the effect of post-Tolkien fantasy happening in this world too, as it's built out, as well as a kind of post-Tolkienian fantastical historical kind of approach to our shared cultural osmotic understanding of what life was like in medieval times. I will show you here a picture of Delphinium Brandybuck, who is a healer who lives in the forest, grieving for her recently deceased mother and generally foraging for herbs and vegetables in the rough and ready, largely uncultivated landscape of the Shire, which is a crucial point that I'll get back to in just a moment. You can see here her dialogue caption here, on this slide. I told her then and there that I wanted to be a healer just like her. These characters are not terribly sophisticated. This is a game partially at least aimed at children, or at least accessible to children. So motivations are pretty clear and pretty superficial. The writing, I've been having this feeling a lot lately. I was talking to my partner about this just this afternoon. I've been having the feeling a lot lately that one of the most interesting things that you can find is a room of writers, one of whom is extremely talented, one of whom is really dialed in to the task at hand, one of whom is really committed to exploring the space, and the others who are doing the necessary work, because there are, even in this game, moments of really great, deft character writing amidst a sea of stuff that is much more commonplace, much more predictable. So I bring this up because Delphinium Brandybuck, and you'll note there, right? Delphinium, absolutely appropriate. The hobbits of the Shire, particularly the hobbits of Bywater, the female hobbits have flower names. We know this is true. This is all one of the ways in which the game really does pay a kind of lip service to the canon detail of Tolkien's work. And there is a tradition of herbal healing, right, in Tolkien's work, Althalas and the like. But it's clearly the case that Althalas, which Sam describes, of course, as being just a weed, is special because of Aragorn and not because of the Althalas itself, or at least it is a combination of the two. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, as we learn. But here in this game, we have a nod toward a kind of rudimentary herbalism, a kind of 1960s almost kind of ecocentric, harmonious coexistence alongside nature, which changes the relationship between the hobbits and their environment. The Shire, as it is presented to us, as you can see from these very few screenshots, I think, is wild and untamed and unstewarded. It is not the garden, the park that Tolkien outlines to us. It is not a carefully ordered agricultural landscape the way that he describes in the books. It is something much more wild, much more fairy, which is great. And honestly, it's kind of aesthetically pleasing, but it's not what we get from the books. And I understand that these changes might be made, right? As we adapt, we make changes for a modern audience, for an audience of players to allow for the possibility of player agency in this space. But it encourages me to think about what is possible in this adaptive space, I suppose, right? This is an unexpected consequence of one of the things which we all, I'm sure, love most about Tolkien's work, which is the depth, the comprehensivity, right? The way that he has so fully developed and explored so many of these ideas, and the ideas that he hasn't fully developed and explored on the page are fully developed and explored in the being of Tolkien himself, right? A man who was given to a kind of self-analysis and exploration of principle. So whether we are talking about the history of Numenor and how the diaspora of the Numenorians changed the face of Middle-earth in the beginning of the Third Age, or the end of the Second Age, I guess, right? Whether we're talking about that, or we're talking about the way that gender operates, or the way that kings work in this space, the way that intercessory grace manifests as eucatastrophe. These things are deep and consistent throughout all of his work. And the product, or a product, of that deep and profound consistency is that we cannot strip the aesthetic elements of Tolkien's work and still have them play. We can't take the iconographic qualities of Tolkien's work. We can't take the proper nouns of Tolkien's work. We can't take even the character outlines, the visual information that we get from the films, for example, or from the original illustrations, and turn them into something else without losing that depth, without losing their coherence, without rendering them, to a greater or lesser extent, silly, hollow, perhaps would be a better word. This is absolutely true of Tales of the Shire, right? A fun, silly game that says a lot of the right things, that does a lot of the right things, but ultimately does not feel like Tolkien. And I've said this before about other video game adaptations, much more successful video game adaptations of Tolkien's world, the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games, the Middle-earth games, released by Warner, I don't know, better part of a decade ago now, I suppose, in which you play a ranger possessed by the spirit of a powerful elf wraith that allows you to go out and murder literally thousands of Uruk-hai. It makes no more sense than Tales of the Shire. You can't take the aesthetic layer away, or you can't preserve the aesthetic layer while severing these underlying ties. And this is not about whether or not these hobbits can have different skin tones, or whether or not they can have different haircuts, or whether or not it's okay that there are blonde hobbits here, even though we are told carefully in the book that Elenor is one of the very rarest golden-haired hobbits, right? That's not what's important. There's something between the very specific aesthetic layer, right? The actual literal manifestation of these images on the screen in front of you, which is not really that important at all, and the spirit that those images evoke, which is extremely important. We can't necessarily wrestle with Tolkien in a superficial way. And I've been thinking about this too. I know I've been talking about this for a little while, but it continues to be true. I am falling once more into Star Wars. It's happening all over again. It keeps happening. And I've been thinking a lot about what makes Star Wars films either feel like they are Star Wars or not feel like they are Star Wars. And it has very little to do, let me tell you, I've spent a lot of time considering this, and it has very little to do with who directs them or their level of canonicity, or whether they are a numbered episode or a side story. There are numbered episodes which do not feel like Star Wars, and there are side stories which feel more like Star Wars than almost anything else. I am a well-attested, well-documented fan of Rogue One, and of course, now we're looking at Andor 2, and these stories occupy a similar position relative to the core text. That is to say that they are either replicating the aesthetic sensibility of the piece and therefore coming out hollow, coming out as insubstantial, coming out as internally inconsistent or internally baffling. Prequel trilogy, I'm looking at you, or we're looking deeper, we're looking at the core ideas, we're looking at the fundamentals, and replicating the aesthetics in light of those principles, in light of the underlying philosophies. Rogue One, for example, I think is much more successful in that space. It's fascinating to think about how the aesthetics, the iconography of Tolkien's world, as I say, generations of fantasy authors have proven to us, thankfully, helpfully. They have just lined our bookshelves with obvious and demonstrable proof that the aesthetics of Tolkien's world are not trivially portable. It takes a much greater understanding of what Tolkien is doing, right? Not just trying to do, not just creating, but what he himself is bringing to the work, the bedrock under the substance of the story. It takes a great understanding of that to really replicate the feeling of The Lord of the Rings. I will conclude this thought with a skeet that I put out on Blue Sky just a little while ago because I was thinking a lot about the Rings of Power, and I'm very pleased with this analogy, so I wanted to share it all here with you on the podcast, because it struck me as I was thinking about the Rings of Power that the Rings of Power, as I wrote on Blue Sky, is a show that can sink a ball from half court. It can sink a basket from half court without any trouble at all, and will trip over every single coffee table in the vicinity. It does understand some things about the big movements of Tolkien's storytelling, but boy, it doesn't understand a lot of them. We'll continue to talk about the Rings of Power as we move forward. Before we get to that, let me see, how am I doing for time? I'm doing fine. I think we're probably going to do about 10 more minutes, and then we'll wrap up here because, as I say, I'm just getting my podcasting feet back under me. And I only really have one more major topic that I wanted to discuss, which is this, as you can see on your screen in front of you. MythCon 54, the Mythopoeic Society, yes. The Mythopoeic Society's yearly Moot MythCon is happening in July. This is in Weatherford, Oklahoma. It is about 2 hours west of me, July 24th to the 27th, 2026. I'm not, sponsored or affiliated with MythCon in any way. In fact, I bring it up now kind of as a means of holding my own feet to the fire, because if I have a moment of time between here and the end of March, I am going to propose a paper, probably on the mechanics of portal fantasy, probably with specific reference to Lewis and the works of Guy Gabriel Kay, who worked with Christopher Tolkien preparing the Silmarillion in the late 1970s. That is in accord with their Route 66, with travel and transit as the major theme of MythCon 54. And I'm hoping, as I say, to make it out there in July. So if you guys are anywhere nearby, I would encourage you to check out MythCon 54 and come visit me in the great state of Oklahoma in the relatively safe month of July. I say this from the perspective of someone who has been dealing with tornado warnings this very week and hopes to not deal with them very often again in the rest of this year. That is going to do it. I think that is the last topic that I have. Let's take a look then at this schedule as we're looking ahead. Next week, I know I'm going to talk about the other show, the show that I do when I'm not doing Shire Reckoning, Stars and Swords. Next week on March 17th, hopefully back in our regular Tuesday night slot, I will be concluding our aborted discussion on William Gibson's Neuromancer, the definitive cyberpunk text. I don't necessarily want to collapse that into one single episode, but we've lost a lot of our momentum because of this terrible hiatus, and I think it's a good thing to wrap that up and to kind of try and renew ourselves as we move forward in Stars and Swords, a discussion of genre fiction. I'm thinking, and this will probably also go to a Patreon poll sometime in the next couple of weeks, my inclination right now, after we're done with Neuromancer, is to come back to talk about the writer who has perhaps influenced me more than any other besides Professor Tolkien. If I kind of, if I'm decomposed into my atomic matter and put through the finest sieve, you will find, pure, unadulterated atoms of Tolkien influence within me. It's such a huge part of not just how I write, not just how I read, but how I think, how I see the world. There's a lot of Tolkien in my own psychological makeup, my own spiritual makeup, I dare say. But if there is another writer who exists alongside Tolkien in that regard, it is undoubtedly Terry Pratchett. I've been rereading Pratchett's work over the course of the last month because his books are so familiar, because they are so readable, because they are so digestible, because you can on any given page find an idea that is worth exploring, find an idea or a perspective or a metaphor or a joke that will buoy your spirit and carry you through the day. As I've been working so hard, I've just been dipping very erratically and sporadically into Pratchett's corpus, and I think that now would be a great time to talk about Pratchett and his enormous, although I would say oftentimes underemphasized, influence on not just modern fantasy, but modern comedy, modern literature. Truly, he is a broad and varied and brilliant writer, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to talk about some of his work. The only problem with Pratchett is finding a starting point. So that's the thing that we're going to talk about over on the Patreon page. And I'm bringing this up here on Shire Reckoning, partly because obviously there's a lot of crossover between fantasy readers who like Tolkien and fantasy readers who like Pratchett. So I think that you guys might well have opinions about where to start in terms of our analysis of Pratchett. I have never academically, critically studied Pratchett's, I have on my own time, but I've never podcasted about Pratchett, and I'd really value the opportunity to do so. So what I'm thinking there is that we might just do an overview episode, looking at the man, looking at his work, looking at his enormously productive career, and then dial into a single book that we will probably cover in 2 episodes, because Pratchett is a fast read, and there's a lot of good. Dot says, just revisited The Wee Free Man recently. I love The Wee Free Man. Yes, this is it. When I think of Pratchett, I could name 20 books and not get to The Wee Free Man, but then I think of them and they're just fantastic. I've never read the Tiffany Aching books. I have to go back and read. These are later in Pratchett's career. His I guess it's not quite middle school, but it is a YA series oriented around a young witch, which is material that he has tapped before in his career, but really kind of comes back to in his latter years. I've never read any of those books, so they would be fascinating too. I think we would probably pick, either Witches Abroad as the functionally introductory witches book, if we want to talk about Granny Weatherwax and we want to talk about Nanny Og and we want to talk about Pratchett's own kind of intertextuality with his sense of art and stories and how they operate, which is a more sophisticated perspective than you will get from just about any other writer out there. It's a really smart and thoughtful way of interacting with the idea of fictionality within his own text. Or we might start with Guards, which is maybe my favorite, is the introduction of the City Watch storyline, that strand. I think that's a really great book too. Mort, of course, is generally recognized as the acceptable starting point. That is the 4th book. That is when his voice really settles down after some misadventures in the first 3 books, all of which are good, all of which are worth reading, but aren't quite as accessible to a modern reader as Mort is. There's tons. Chris says that seems like a good place to start with Granny Weatherwax. It's honestly hard to argue against Witches Abroad as a starting point, particularly in 2026 when we're thinking about rulership and we're thinking about public trust, and we're thinking about how stories shape and define our reality. As I say, that is, by the way, a metaphorical landscape that I am fatigued by, that I am kind of fundamentally disinterested in at this point in my reading career. So many people have done, but really it's all stories, right? I've got little for that left, but Pratchett does it better than anyone, and that would be a great place to start. Anyway, all of that is to say, next week, we're going to conclude Neuromancer there on Stars and Swords. The following week, we're going to come back with The Desolation of Smaug, then probably some kind of Pratchett something, and then we'll wrap up the Battle of the 5 Armies. And I guess, where does that put us? At the end of April to begin what I hope will be a discussion of Beren and Luthien. I will probably put a poll up, as I say, just for the formality of the thing, right? If you all don't want to read Beren and Luthien, do get in touch and let me know, by the way. Don't just be anonymous on a poll over on the Patreon page. Let me know what is happening and where you would like our explorations to take us next. But I do think that having Beren and Luthien in mind, very, very fresh and recent for a re-examination of The Lord of the Rings, which I think will probably be the next project, I think that's a really strong place for us to be as we consider the oncoming hunt for Gollum. That, I think, is going to do it for tonight. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for your incredible patience, for your notes of support, for your notes of enthusiasm. It has been really hard not podcasting over the last 6 weeks or so. I'm very glad to be back at it. And of course, it is your support that helps this whole thing function, that makes this whole thing function. Head on over to patreon.com/nextword, pledge your support there. And not only do you get access to bonus episodes, I do 1 bonus episode every week. Again, not so much over the last few weeks, but in theory, 1 bonus episode every week with the brilliant Elizabeth Ray called Made It Through Monday, where we just catch up on our pop cultural consumption for the last week. I'm right now recording a series of improvisational podcasts in which I sit down and I just start talking about my current creativity and the novel that I am developing and will hopefully write by the end of this year, called Works in Progress. That is the name of the podcast, not the novel. No, I don't know the name of the novel. It could be works in progress too. We'll find out together as we move forward through the course of the rest of this year. And every dollar that goes to that Patreon page is a dollar that gets me in this chair, in front of my microphone, in front of my camera, in front of my computer, so that I can make more podcasts. It's a really straightforward transaction. It doesn't get much more clear than that. In this turbulent economic time, it's a one-to-one. And if, of course, you cannot support the show financially, as I know so many people can't right now, that's completely fine. The free feed will always be here. You will always be able to hear the vast majority of the stuff that I put out into the world. And I'm just very grateful and moved that frankly, that anyone is listening to this at all. It is a great pleasure and honor to continue to podcast in your very fine company. That will do it for this week's episode of Shire Reckoning. Join me next week for Stars and Swords and Neuromancer, and the following week, I kid you not, for the desolation of Smaug. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dot. Thank you, Hugh, for joining me here live tonight. I'll talk to you all again very soon. Until then, do please take care. Good night, all.